Most immediately beneficial approach to decentralized identity comes from accepting that identity is something that authorities are going to be issuing, but that everything else kind of goes back to the hands of users to be able to defend for themselves. So to me, self-sovereign as a name was always like a misleading one, because what I really wanted was an identity system that has no authorities whatsoever. So I wish that self-sovereign only exclusively referred to users are in control of their credentials and certificates, and also they're either their own authority issuer or are responsible for authorizing and issuing some of their friends.
One thing that we're trying to also imagine here is like, how would long-term futures look like if these technologies are implemented versus not implemented?
Every bit of data that you're leaking is basically ground that you're ceding in terms of like negotiations. It's actually value that you're losing, and basically it's going to be used against you in some way. So if you imagine the world where all of your data is leaked and it is fully weaponized and monetized against you, and so from that perspective, it's a little easier to I think now think of taking back control over our sensitive data, and that'll lead to a lot better outcomes.
Welcome to the very, very first episode of Shielded Transactions. This is a Zcash Foundation sponsored Foresight podcast with top cryptography researchers, privacy activists, regulators, DeFi entrepreneurs, consumers, and more on why and how shielded transactions should be part of our lives and what we risk by giving them up. So thank you so much to the Zcash Foundation for allowing us to host this series. Thank you also to the Smart Contract Research Forum for helping us edit and produce the podcast. And thank you to Foresight's Intelligent Cooperation Group for initiating the series during last year's program. And thank you now for joining. So you're kind of behind the scenes of the podcast. I'll be leading with a few questions, and perhaps at the end of time, hopefully we get to a few of your questions as well. And be mindful that these will be on the podcast that will be released. Okay, cool. Welcome, Andrew, to the series. You're our first guest. Very exciting. So maybe just to share a few words about you. You're an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, and more specifically in the electrical and computer engineering department and an affiliate in computer science. And you're also an associate director at the Initiative for Cryptocurrencies and Contracts, IC3, and a board member of the Zcash Foundation. And you, as the director of the Decentralized Systems Lab, your research really focuses broadly on computer security, but also really on the design of secure decentralized systems and cryptocurrencies. You are contributing really to quite a few technical programs, programming languages in cryptography and distributed computing. How I met you was at the Financial Cryptography Conference in Curaçao, and now a few years ago already. And more particularly at the evening, they always had a session where people could give like 5-minute little talks, and you read out this really fantastic poem that you produced, which I'll share here in the chat and hopefully also in the podcast notes. And it's called "If I Hard Forked: The Doxing of Satoshi." I'll only read out like maybe 3 lines, but it goes like, if I hard forked, would he mind it? Would he mind it if I forked it? Would he mind it? Would Satoshi, would he mind it? If Satoshi, if I hard forked, if Satoshi, would he mind it if I forked it? If I forked it, if Satoshi, would he mind it if Satoshi, if I soft forked, if I hard forked, if Satoshi, if I soft forked, if I soft forked, would he mind it? And would he mind it if I hard forked? And it goes on, and it's really quite a beautiful poem. I'll share more info here in the chat, but for now we'll focus on shielded transactions. So thank you so much for joining. Perhaps to bring us up to speed, I'll be leading with a few questions, and you can kind of pick and choose the ones that you want to spend more time on and the ones that you want to spend less time on. There's different questions that directed to I think a few different focus areas, but in a nutshell, perhaps bring us up to speed on just what's happening right now in private transactions. Like, how are we looking geopolitically or on a US basis? What's going on? Should we be worried at all, or are we doing quite an okay job?
Yeah, thank you so much for that cool introduction. It's neat to see you all here, and yeah, I'm pretty happy for this opportunity to chat with this group. I didn't realize this would be the first of the podcast series, but I tried to read up on the group. I don't know so much about it, but I recognize a whole lot of you, so it's cool to be here. I had something that I wanted to start with before catching up on the shielded transactions, but it kind of feeds into it. I saw that the premise of this group, beyond some topics I recognize, like blockchain technology, is about encouraging new kinds of cooperation. And so I wanted to, I don't know if you're familiar with this paper, but I wanted to explain it a bit. It's a related work I like talking about, but I haven't come back to in a while. I was trying to take a bigger picture of where some of the cryptography technology I think will most be useful. And this paper is from behavioral economics. It's called Directed Altruism versus Enforced Reciprocity. This is directed altruism and enforced reciprocity. And the premise of this relates to understanding better the fundamentals of how cooperation works, especially in ways that kind of play off topics like anonymity and fine-grained information disclosure, which is where the shielded transactions are headed. So it's really, this is a great abstract. So if you're following around, you might be able to follow along with this, but I'll explain the part that I think is the most inspiring here. It basically says there's three explanations for the cooperative behavior. Like cooperative behavior, you see it in like people cooperate with each other, even complete strangers, more than pure game theory would predict. But otherwise, we don't have great models for how that works, why people cooperate. So there's like three kinds of explanations for this that are kind of tiers on each other. So one is baseline altruism, and that's like when you'll cooperate with complete anonymous strangers on the internet. Someone random in your community. There's enforced reciprocity, which is, I think, the standard tit for tat kind of reasoning, that the reason you cooperate is because you're likely to encounter, or the reason you're more likely to cooperate with friends, people you know, rather than total strangers, is because you're likely to encounter them again. So you can respond based on how cooperative they are when you meet them, say, this first time. And the third explanation is this directed altruism in the middle, which says that you are more likely to be cooperative with friends, but even in a case where there's no ability for you to play tit for tat with them, somehow, not that you're never going to see them again, but you know who they are, but no information about your interaction is going to leak to them. And so what they wanted to do was make this experiment. It's a behavioral economics like lab experiment. So like, $10 rewards for college students participating. But what I found interesting, in this is an economics paper, no cryptography in it. It's from 2007, so it predates the blockchain excitement. But they have a really cool experiment that involves anonymity. So baseline altruism would be really easy to, that's straightforward to measure in the lab experiments. You just, you play like a dictator game or a prisoner's dilemma game, and you don't see the person that you're matched with, so you don't have any idea who they are. And the enforced reciprocity is also pretty straightforward to capture in this behavioral economics setting, because that's the ordinary setting where you see who you're playing against, and there's someone who's in your social circle. So you're playing against your friend. They lose the prisoner's dilemma game. They know who you are, so they can get back at you after you all go home and back. And so you wouldn't think that it would even be really feasible to capture the directed altruism setting in the experiment, because it seems to have this conflict of, you want to have information about how trusting you are, cooperative you are to people in your social circle, to your friends, but any setting where any information leaks about that, where they show up and play the game and learn that they played with you, that would seem to then reveal that brings all of the reciprocity enforcement back in. So the solution that they came up to it is kind of an anonymity technology. I mean, it's simple in the setting they did it. It's not decentralized or trustless, but they basically said, give us your inputs in the form of this unfolded, expanded game. Basically say which move in the prisoner's dilemma or dictator game you would pick if you were matched with these 100 different people from within and without your social circle. And then they only selected a subset of those to actually carry out the instructions according to it. So the net result of this is you join the game, you make a bunch of inputs, basically like a rating for every one of your friends, meaning will you cooperate with them? And then at the end of the game, you get a total amount of reward, and You don't learn which other friends matched against you, and you don't learn which friends even your choices ended up having an effect on their overall reward. And the results basically put these in order. You're more likely to be cooperative and trusting of your friends than of total strangers. And predictably, perhaps you're more likely to cooperate when matched with your friends in the setting that your friends will learn that you did it in the enforced reciprocity setting. But what they still found is that there's some degree to which you're more likely to cooperate with friends than you will with total strangers, even in a setting where those friends you cooperate with will never know whether or not you cooperated with them. They'll be completely unable to enforce anything. So it's not a tit for tat game. So it's a kind of force to cooperate that's beyond what's captured by just tit for tat settings. And the reason why I brought this up in the context of the shielded transaction questions is, I think that this basically points to kind of a important potential that if we use more kind of creativity or inspiration, we can see how shielded transactions kinds of platforms could support this, because it's basically about, it suggests that there's opportunities for applications to make use of essentially trust-sensitive information between users, but that only makes sense in a context where that information isn't just published and leaked. So maybe I'll pause there. That was a tangent and an intro, but maybe we could start there.
Well, could you be a little bit more specific? If someone, for example, was listening to this also on YouTube and was like, what kinds of interactions would be possible? I think, we can think about it on a more theoretical level, but, is there, this is, far-fetched, but is there a potential app for which this would actually be useful?
Yeah, I mean, the usual setting where I think of this kind of thing is closest to like trading partner recommendations. So I mean, that's perhaps most similar in concept to OpenBazaar or other reviews and ratings collecting marketplaces. I guess the difference between the thing that I'm pointing to there and those is that in a system like OpenBazaar, you are publishing for anyone to see the reviews that you have. There's no distinction of, say, a private review input to the system. Maybe a way of being more specific about the idea here is to say, imagine a rating system where you would enter in reviews and those reviews would not be published. They would be kept completely secret within the system. But what would be useful is that your friends would be able to get trading recommendations of I don't know, either offers, or it's still kind of hypothetical or abstract here, but say they get recommendations of people to trade with on OpenBazaar, but they don't necessarily learn that you're recommending this trader on OpenBazaar because you've interacted with them a bunch. It's less information disclosure required than that. The only thing you need to know in the context of this rating or recommendation system is that based on your friends' input trust, it would make sense for you to trade with them. You don't need to know the details of all of the transaction history of your friends. So yeah, maybe that's my best example.
Okay, well, we already got a comment in the chat here that this particular example has reputation but no reciprocity. I mean, it is already kind of striking that people are more cooperative even if they know that they're friends, that there is no possibility for reciprocity. Could you comment on this, perhaps? Like, there is perhaps this reciprocity layer missing.
I guess let me interpret the comment maybe two ways. One would be about like how it works, or the other would be about like what's an even lower level kind of a root cause explanation of why people would be friendly towards their friends. I mean, I think that there's a sense in which it's like dilution of enforcement here. Like in some sense, you will be. I think an explanation is that if you are, generous or cooperative with your friends, it will tend to circle back and benefit you. The difference between, this enforced reciprocity and the more general one is basically whether you're able to associate it to a particular other, individual making that decisions versus just having it be the result of the cumulative total of all of your interactions with people to whom you have a rating in such a system.
Okay, we kind of like dove in on the deep end of like the kind of example that I think will be really insightful for many people here in this group, because I think many people here already accept that, you know, generally speaking, private transactions do have value also in normal settings, and this is like more of an kind of like you know, a creative setting in which we could have more cooperation than we currently have with these types of transactions. But perhaps, you know, do you have any other examples of these types of things? I know that you've done, because we're already there, so we might as well stay in the deep end for a while before we descend again to shallow waters. But you know, I think you published a little bit also on what could be possible in a more of a health, even in a healthcare system with more shielded transactions, and you know, a few other like games that you published there. And so perhaps you have a few ideas of alternative.
There's a couple of examples that I would, I can explain the focus of what my research projects have been. So in the Decentralized Systems Lab, we've mainly been working on a couple of fairly general purpose platforms for computing on confidential data. One of them is based on multi-party computation. This is this Honeybadger MPC line of work. And I could talk a little bit about our latest application, Honeybadger Swap, which is kind of closer to shielded assets because it's a kind of you know, DeFi swapping application, but that has extra confidentiality guarantees.
For those who are not aware, maybe say in one sentence or so, just what is a secure multi-party computation?
Sure. So secure multi-party computation is a way of computing on secret data that's kept confidential because the data is secret shared. So secret sharing is, you can think of it as a kind of encryption. It's a kind of encoding for multiple servers. And you would need some majority of those servers to come together to be able to, you know, disclose any of that information or leak it. But by carrying out a multi-party computation protocol, they can actually compute results on that encoded data without ever making it plain text or collecting it anywhere. It's a very flexible programming environment where you can point to, this is the data that's kept completely confidential. This is a query on that data that's disclosed. As a kind of theoretical framework, it's extremely you know, flexible in terms of what kinds of policies you can express, and gives you fault tolerant guarantees.
Lovely. That's a great explanation. And what kinds of things could this unlock?
Sure. So one of the challenges with MPC is that compared to simply computing on something in plain text, it's pretty heavyweight. So this depends for sure on the application. That's true in some settings and not others. But performance is fairly challenging. So one of the main things that we've been trying to do is find applications where you can hide the cost, or where the value of the transaction is so much that it's like a bulk transaction and a good fit. So I think of our use of MPC in this Honeybadger Swap line of projects as it's a little bit of like a scavenger's attitude. Like, rather than try to contribute to the cryptography of solving this performance problem, we're going to, you know, scavenge for some you know, unexploited low-hanging fruit, basically, of where you can hide latency because the latency isn't quite so important, or or where the overall costs aren't so important because they're used for, say, transactions that are settling a large amount of value. So the I guess I should also say in kind of where this MPC fits in compared to shielded transactions is that the use that we have of MPC is for applications where something like Zcash today transactions aren't enough. Basically, the suite of tools that are bulletin boards and commitments and zero knowledge proofs. So the challenge with zero knowledge proofs, or the limitation of zero knowledge proofs in that technology stack, is that you have to have some prover who has the secret information, the account balance, the transaction semantics, you know, the sender receiver of the transaction. The prover has to have that in order to compute the proof. And the availability of that data also begins and ends with the prover. If they delete their transaction history, there's no one, and their keys, there's no one else on the network who's able to go revive that. And that's great when that's sufficient, but for tasks like auctions, anything that kind of fundamentally requires computing a function of many different parties' private inputs without kind of reconciling, you know, one party is in charge of seeing all of those inputs, then it seems that you need something beyond the bulletin board commitments and zero knowledge proofs. And that's where the MPC approach will fit in. So for concrete examples, the one that we've been looking at so far is basically exchange applications like order books or automated market makers, where the transactions are potentially of high value, but we use the MPC to hide things like the dark pool sides, the size of dark pools, the amount of bids that aren't matched. Basically, it's to build an auction that's effective enough for price discovery and what you need to use the market mechanism for, but has a policy of disclosing as little information as possible about the individual trades, the bids made by users, and in particular, the residual bids that weren't matched because they're not part of the output of the auction. But they leak information about the rest of the bid that you might try to place in later auctions. So
can I break in, Andrew?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think I understand zero knowledge computations, and I think you're talking about automated market makers, and I understand how book orders work with an automated market maker. The piece that seems inconsistent, that I don't understand what's going on, is if you've got an automated market maker, it has a price level and everybody wants to know the price level. And so when a trade happens, that affects not just the individual who made the trade, it also affects the balances in the pools that tell you what the price currently is. So if you're able to, I mean, it would seem like shielding the individual transaction doesn't help if you have to reveal the pool balances so that people know what the price level is. So can you do both of those at the same time, or are you pooling transactions somehow so you can't tell individual transactions while you're changing the pool?
Yeah, perfect question. So I mean, the short answer is we get around this by batching. I mean, so the problem is that inherently, if you're collecting transactions and providing price discovery, if you're providing price discovery at the same rate as transactions, like after every transaction you see the updated price, that's not
batching is a perfect answer.
Technology, yeah. But that's, I think, a good example where this MPC would be required. It would be hard to do that kind of batching just with bulletin board and zero knowledge proofs. You wouldn't want the thing where someone commits to the transaction, then they're all batched, and then they run away before revealing or making use of that committed transaction. So the MPC fits in basically as the buffer that holds all of the transactions while guaranteeing their availability before such time as they can be committed. And then you only reveal a price, at the end of that batch. And there's a utility trade-off. It's hard for me to claim that this is like the most important thing to fix exchanges. It also has the advantage of providing or preventing front running and ordering extractable value attacks kind of along the way. There's other ways of preventing that that are easier than this, but this also does that. But you get that trade-off between utility and the fine-grainedness of the price discovery and the confidentiality of the bids.
Very cool. Well, we also had recently Georgis Kassis here from OpenMind, and they're working, also on federated learning a bunch. So I don't know if you've looked into this at all, and it's totally fine if not, but I think, pairing this type of computation, not only for exchanges, but even for allowing different parties that have different data actually collaborate on their data using AI, even if they're if they don't trust each other. That always seemed to me like such an incredible bottleneck that could unlock so much more cooperation across mutually distrusting partners without really them having to give a bunch of the information up. I think that's especially interesting just because it potentially avoids more centralization. Digital actors in a decentralized way could cooperate with the data without giving it away. You could potentially compensate for more of the, more of the data giants that you currently see arising. So I'm super curious if you looked into this at all. This is a total tangent, but I think it's really interesting.
No, yeah, absolutely. I would say that kind of speaks to the other side of what my research group is doing in terms of these platforms for confidential data. So we've the problem with the machine learning task is, okay, I can explain a little bit where the need for a platform fits in terms of federated learning. So what I most want to see are techniques where you don't necessarily have to have the data broker like a hospital in the case of federated learning. So like the federated learning model is typically explained as, each hospital has its own patients and it's okay holding the data of those patients. And you want the hospitals to be able to, coordinate on machine learning without having to share with each other. And you achieve this by each hospital is able to do its own local computing based on the data that it has. So we're working on this kind of speculative project right now that's really interesting, but it's about wellness data rather than just healthcare data. And the distinction there is that healthcare data is for patients who have already shown up at the hospital because they were sick, and then they trusted the hospital with that data because they needed healthcare treatment, and that's a pretty fair, they're going to trust the hospital with data in that setting. But wellness data is for everyone, and the hospitals don't have these massive data sets of well people because the well people don't show up to the hospital to exchange data. So it's a slightly different tweak to the problem to look at, what could you do with a much larger scale collection of data, including healthy people. And it's there that it seems more plausible that having a confidentiality technology for it would be something that would encourage them to join more. So federated learning doesn't immediately solve that because you would want not even the hospital to have your entire data set and your genome and whatever, just in order to participate. So the approach that we are looking at is one based on trusted hardware enclaves like SGX. And this has been something that's fairly new for me to look into because my first exposure to SGX was many years ago, and I really disliked the trust model, where it seems to rely on a fairly small number of trusted vendors, and they're kind of always in the loop. Like if they lose their attestation keys, then all of the bets are off. So it's not the good kind of like trusted setup once and done party, but like an ongoing party. And you have to trust the, hardware, which is proprietary, and it's not even hardware, it's all like updatable, firmware and microcodes. And we've already seen all of, the attacks grow on them. And now I feel like everyone's kind of caught up to that, but now I'm done with being pessimistic about that. So I'm actually more excited by, I think, the interesting questions that are kind of more effective to tackle with SGX and related hardware enclave approaches. And I think that it's a really good fit actually for this kind of, how could you do federated learning for, socially useful purposes like contributing to a big valuable data set, but without having to collect all of the user's plain text data, in order to contribute to it. And so the kind of use case and setting that we're looking at, hardware enclaves for is basically settings where you have, a hospital as like a somewhat trusted party that you can rely on to, for example, not just run SGX in the low effort co-tenant setting where it's most likely to be under attack because it's like shared hardware resources where anyone could run like a perfect enclave system. It would be safe to run co-tenant cloud services with it, but a practical one wouldn't. So in a setting where there's some amount of trust of the IT security side of it, but still you want the benefit of being able to credibly show that you don't have a secret business model that's based on in bulk exploiting all of the data set and just giving the plain text away. I think that the trade-offs in setting is a little more favorable for it there. And for an extremely data intensive task like the training step in federated learning, I think that the performance benefits of then using trusted hardware enclaves versus a purely crypto solution are kind of more appealing. So that's kind of the setting that we've been looking at for that.
I would love for you maybe to introduce maybe two more quick concepts, and then I want you to tie them all together in like let's say a not utopian, but like a prototypian approach to what a future could look like if we implement them all well. So one thing that I would be very curious for you to speak about is more on your work on decentralized identity, and maybe just to tie that in also the work on zero knowledge proofs. I know that you've glanced over this very quickly, but those are two other ingredients. And if there's any missing, then please also, if you want to speak a little bit about that, why are they important? Why are they important now? And then after that, we tie that maybe to a long-term future.
Yeah, identity is really tricky. I'm really interested in the kind of effort of self-sovereign identity, which has taken me a long time to kind of come to grips with what it means. But to me, the kind of most immediately beneficial approach to decentralized identity comes from accepting that identity is something that authorities, a small number of them, likely governments, are going to be accepted of issuing, but that everything else kind of goes back to the hands of users to be able to defend for themselves, and that'll lead to a lot better outcomes. So to me, self-sovereign as a name was always like a misleading one, because what I really wanted was an identity system that has no authorities whatsoever. So I wish that self-sovereign only exclusively referred to users are in control of their credentials and certificates, and also they're either their own authority issuer or are responsible for authorizing and issuing some of their friends. And I don't have as clear of a vision of how to explain how that will come, but well, maybe the stuff that we talked about earlier about the potential to use vouching relationships between friends who know each other in an external world as part of such a system. Maybe that's where that would fit in there.
One thing that we're trying to also imagine here is like, how would long-term futures look like if these technologies are implemented versus not implemented? And I think that many of them have been a long time coming, but now recently really progress has been quite accelerating, at least from a layman's perspective that I have on these technologies. So could you perhaps draw us out like a future in some color of what could we look forward to, a pretty cooperative world if we use these technologies much more, and then afterwards we get into a little bit of a dystopia. But perhaps give us some carrot of like why should lay people care about this? What kinds of future cooperative arrangements would be possible with these types of technology?
I think it's important to have to me, the most compelling medium-term future vision is I think closest to this idea of a marketplace for sensitive data. So this is basically the idea that the reason why you should care about privacy and why adopting privacy enhancing tech is worthwhile is that every bit of data that you're leaking is basically ground that you're ceding in terms of like negotiations. It's actually value that you're losing, and basically it's going to be used against you in some way. This is kind of a perspective that I've built up after playing with a lot of DeFi recently. And so I almost think of it as like data extractable value as an analog to minor extractable value in transactions. So the consequence of leaking your transactions to a mempool in DeFi before you get committed is that everyone gets to peek at your transactions and they just immediately use it against you. And it's hilariously fun and pleasing. You can like watch yourself get sandwich attacked in real time for pennies on any smart contract system that has an automated market there. You can watch the dark forest interact with you with like a fishing hook in real time. It's great. And I think thinking from that lens as a default, it's a little easier to go back and revisit this, like, what's the ultimate goal of privacy? How does privacy fit into society more? And if you think of it that way, any transaction metadata that you're leaking, anything you're leaking at all, like it's either going to be ingested by an advertising AI and then used against you to extract the most price out of you. So if you imagine the world where all of your data is leaked and it is fully weaponized and monetized against you, it's like you get the worst possible price you'd accept in every commercial interaction you have for the rest of your life. Just everything shown to you is like the worst price that it would accept. It knows that because it's trained on you so well with the freshest real-time, up-to-speed, comprehensive data. And so from that perspective, it's a little easier to I think now think of taking back control over our sensitive data as something that's for an economic value and a bottom line approach, if not for just the like defending activists and more maybe abstract or at a distance kind of purpose for it. So I kind of think that this is now like a private DeFi, for example, will eventually be a path towards more deployed privacy, where the privacy refers to by default not leaking any of your data, having the ability to disclose it where it's useful to you, or in the case of like genome data or something, like you either use it for socially good purposes or for you're getting a good deal on it if it's going to be contributed in some way. So I think that's that's my favorite narrative of the medium term utopia to look forward to.
Yeah, sounds great and pretty tangible. To make it more tangible, one person in the chat would love to know your perspective on Proof of Humanity, on the Proof of Humanity project when we talked about decentralized identity.
Yeah, so one thought that I've been having recently, and I don't know how to I don't know quite what to do with this, but I'd want to talk it about in this context. I would love for a desired feature of a truly decentralized identity project to have a Jubilee-friendly quality. Like you should be able to reset your identity entirely and re-roll with a completely fresh identity in the system that's untethered to your original one in any way. And this is a problem for this kind of has its origin in like receipt freeness and like anti-coercion in e-voting schemes, which can be fairly tricky. So there, the attack model is someone's taken your keys, like any secret info that you've had, they've just physically taken it from you, and the system design goal then is, and even in that case, you still show up by some secondary path and go in person and cancel your old vote and replace it with this new fresh vote. A system that has this property is kind of defended against kinds of coercion behaviors. So the thing that I would want in a decentralized identity is I can always refresh my identity from scratch, even if I've lost my keys for it. And still every use of my identity would be either fully anonymous or entirely fine-grained up to me, which information I disclose from it. So you could imagine like being able to leave your past behind in one town, move to a new town, entirely fresh identity, everything your name left behind, but still you can show up and somehow, whether you go to a physical place or a DMV or some dark DMV alternative, you would regenerate an ID that you can use for basic services or basic income or access to computer equipment or something like that.
Very cool. I know that, for example, a few folks have been talking a little bit about pseudonymity and maybe having transferable reputation on even with your pseudonyms, even across platforms or something. A long time ago, Mark Miller and Eric wrote on basically that positive reputation systems still work even in pseudonymous economies, because positive reputation is you can transfer that with your pseudonyms, while a negative one, obviously, it's easy to just create a new one. And so I'm curious to see whether you have any ideas on whether or not reputation, or like whether or not, or in what context should reputation, or could it carry over with pseudonyms? A few people have argued in favor of a reputation being transferable, even maybe between different decentralized social networks or something. If people have said, well, why should it? And yeah, maybe you've thought at all about this.
Okay, yeah, I have a bunch of thoughts of this. We'll see how coherently these come out in this way. I mean, so there's definitely something to a pseudonym that develops reputation on its own, just from its own merits. And this is also one of the fun things that was like predicted a lot in these early papers, like you mentioned. Now you just see them happen in like the DeFi world in this kind of dramatic scale of say projects with completely pseudonymous founders, and the mapping many to one to many is unclear, and yet these completely pseudonymous entities build up such strong reputations from their writing and their good works of code and everything that they develop a pretty significant amount of trust. So I think that that's kind of the limit of the pseudonym identity, though, is that it's entirely based on the actions of that pseudonym. It doesn't bring in the reputation from external places where it might have originated. And I think that I do think that there's like an over-reliance on fairly simplistic reputation, even the implicit kind, not the like reputation systems, but in like the DeFi world, just in the amount of trust that many of the most widely used systems have are extremely vulnerable to rug pulls. Rug pulls is just the trendy term for the trusted third-party attack. It's not a subtle attack. It's just they walk away with all of the money because they're the admin and that's what they're set up to do, and they're an anonymous character. So but you can trust them based on they're an old anonymous character. They've been producing writing for years. I think that there's an over-reliance, and it basically just points to like the we're so early and there aren't really these great solutions yet. So even like crappy reputation is still interesting when it's implied in this DeFi setting. So the stuff that I'm most interested in, I do think involves this kind of quality of linking in some way external reputation as well. So, I mean, maybe the way to reconcile these is imagine a pseudonym that has its own reputation from its own, posts and writing and works and all, but it also is supercharged by its, ability to link in existing trust in a perhaps real world person or someone with a more public identity. What you should expect to get from the, shielded transactions platform is the ability to make use of that external information without actually just disclosing it. Like just disclosing the information is always overkill. And I think the ideal systems that we're building and the technology is kind of well suited to, the default policy would be disclose as little information as possible. So I think that we'll be seeing more uses in decentralized identity as well as in other kind of cryptocurrency projects where you can, using zero knowledge, you can make use of external context like the real world without actually just having to disclose it and publish it.
Thanks. I think, we already talked a little bit about the dystopia in a more personal, consumer setting, really. But I think one of the things that this podcast is also trying to do is just make people more aware of the pretty, really negative futures that we could be walking into, where at the point that we realize how negative they are, it is too late to add privacy, like icing on the cake. And so, I think many people here are motivated by that risk and by that threat, which is why they're working on it, but not everyone really knows about it. So perhaps, is there a good either example, or is there just like a future that we should really be trying to avoid, that if we just continue like we currently do, with many of our default systems, we could be, like sleepwalking into? Like, are there any specific bits that you're worried about?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. I think I'm not great at answers to, I think the most important things to kind of anticipate or predict. I don't have enough of the, broad real world knowledge to be able to say something useful about what the most plausible, next dystopic events would be. I could explain a kind of path towards that that is if things keep going in the same way in terms of I think blockchain technology efforts, I think that there are a few important pitfalls. I basically think that what's happening is what little I learn about like real world institutions, governance, financial institutions, and how they work is that there are so many parts of their designs that have privacy as an unintended side effect. And this is the same observation you see a lot with like, sharing of law enforcement data. Like often there's privacy built in because every individual district has its own completely incompatible system software. There's no policy that says we choose to, defend privacy for, these class of information, but you have privacy by accident because that's just how the systems originated. And I think this is basically pervasive in banking as well, and in financial institutions. So I think that the DeFi world is move fast and break things. That's not really right, because they're move fast and build something entirely parallel and separate. So it's not, it's not exactly breaking things, but it's building to the side of them. But it's super weird what you see with DeFi right now, where it's almost, in terms of privacy, the full, everything right now is fully published, and the most exciting projects have these, full transparency logs of every transactions. It's ridiculous how it's like it'll have to get much worse in terms of privacy before it gets better. I think that there's a big risk of relying on blockchain technology automatically fixing privacy, and it would be a mistake of attribution, where if the only reason why we have existing privacy is because there was no policy choice, but it's a mistake. I think the next systems that get built by inattentive blockchain engineers who aren't, paying attention to this, but simply following, use this technology, it cryptographizes, your entire application. I think it's very likely that we'll end up with a bunch of, very dystopic blockchain systems that present rigidity, like excuses not to fix problems for people, like your name's spelled wrong in this blockchain. Well, that's immutable. So, there's no way to fix it. It's permanent. While at the same time having, the most completely predictable, deliberate backdoors built in, just because that's the obvious way to build it. And I think it's really pervasive, the kind of simple attitude that just adding some kind of cryptography to it, fixes privacy. And, of course that's wrong, but I think that's a sort of nearer term pitfall that I hope we can avoid.
Yeah, I mean, especially as near term, more commerce will actually move onto those chains and will then actually be potentially traced back to your actual physical address. Hopefully we may not have to see the first actually physical extortions or kidnapping for people to start caring about this. Given how much money people probably made by having early transacted on public blockchains, I think this is like a real terrible risk that we can avoid by just switching, but probably people need to wake up, need to have this insane wake up call for actually starting to care, and then it may be too late. But yeah, anyway, it's just more problems. But Eugene had I think a more constructive question here.
Yeah, so I guess building on what you were just saying, Andrew, I mean, where does the change start? Because I think there's a lot of enthusiasm coming into Web3 in the last decade of like, ooh, new incentives and platforms equals the world's better. And we're seeing that some things just boil down to fundamental human problems, and it might not be as simple as just slapping a new tech tool and things are better. So where do you think do you think this might end up coming from sort of the cultural or more individual level side where the change actually begins, or what do you see as actually the starting point of us getting to a future that might actually embrace that at scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the thing that makes it really difficult to anticipate is I don't think that technology can solve everything, and so clearly like the biggest wins, or many huge potential wins to focus on, would be on like changing policies to guarantee privacy provisions, to try to. But ultimately I think that those are hard for me to know how to anticipate or how to directly try to influence. So I always feel sort of stuck there. So I'm excited about this. I think that there's kind of cognitive room in the cryptocurrency world for the privacy technologies to be adopted. I'm still the most optimistic thing that I think ever happened was getting to see how quickly all of the blockchain engineers were able to wrap their minds around zero knowledge proofs. And now that's pretty much like an accepted part of the engineering toolbox. So to me, that work has already been done, and I think we're going to see the benefit of that play out. So basically, even though there's this like worse before it gets better in terms of like spewing huge amounts of new public financial transaction data that weren't even previously there, now there's this huge bizarre data set. Even though that seems like ridiculous and going in the wrong direction, I think the cognitive work of showing that part of this stack includes this technology that's right there. It's not the first thing that you used, but everyone knows that zero knowledge proofs come next after you're good at like the plain text level of smart contract development now. So I think that the kind of gradual path towards this, where like shielded assets and things Zcash do fit in, I think is increasingly effective and less distance. I think soon it'll basically be people know that they should be using privacy enhancing tech and shielded transactions, and maybe there's a long period where they still don't because it's easier not to, but at least they know that they should, and that's I think like a marker of the shift towards shortly after that, and I think more people will be able to.
So again, almost like privacy is almost like a collateral advantage just by virtue of the fact that many of the ZK enabled solutions are just more effective and or allow you to do a few more things.
Yeah, definitely.
So maybe well, you've obviously worked on this for quite a while, and I think Zcash really had a really strong focus on this from the get-go. Now we see much more interest in the space. But could you talk a little bit more about what's happening on the ZK on the Zcash front, or what's happening generally in that ecosystem? Like what kinds of technologies can we see maybe coming online there, or what are future applications or just improvements on Zcash that we could look forward to here?
Yeah, there's too many for me to do the best job of explaining all of them. I tend to have a fairly kind of focused and narrow view on just a handful of. I mostly get to work on the very fun sciencey projects. So I mean, I think the most important things that are upcoming are first of all the Halo Orchard upgrade. I think that that's like in a way, it's like the plumbing detail, because it's, you know, replacing something that worked with something that still works, but, you know, works better in a bunch of ways. But to me, resolving the trusted setup problem is just like it's such a cool cornerstone on this long path towards making, you know, generic and flexible zero knowledge proofs, you know, that also are adequately performant and also get rid of all of the, you know, most unpalatable, you know, setup assumptions. So from a theoretical and, you know, security perspective, I think that the, you know, Orchard upgrade is a really cool achievement. And I think shortly upcoming in, at least I know in the Zcash Foundation's, you know, goals include looking at shielded assets or UDAs. So you know, there's like a path towards improving the programmability of Zcash. And I think it's pretty plausible that the way that that starts is through you know, limited functionality upgrade that's just based on being able to either have you know, versions of assets on other systems, whether they're synthetics or bridged or some other kind of mechanism. I think that that's the thing that I'm most excited about upcoming.
Very cool. Yeah, Zooko actually presented on Halo here in the group with Howard, who presented on Aleo, which is
excellent.
That project and that the DeFi problem that you mentioned. So very cool. We have Mark Miller with a question. Mark, do you want to chime in?
Yeah. Hi, Andrew. When you say that the blockchains in general have come to understand that zero knowledge proofs is kind of the next step to provide the untraceability, generally what we've seen practically deployed is the use of zero knowledge proofs in a cryptocurrency-like way rather than shielding general purpose Turing complete smart contract computation. And I know that that in theory that the zero knowledge proofs can protect that, and a lot of work's been being done, especially with that new language Cairo. But I'm wondering what you can say about what is currently practical and what is currently actually being used with regard to shielding general purpose computation.
Yeah, I think that that's a great question, but I don't think I have good answers for what's currently in use in terms of you know, more general purpose usages of that. The ones that I've seen, that this probably reflects my like recent narrowed focus in DeFi style applications. So yeah, I also only see the ones that are, you know, cryptocurrency, you know, mixing in some way. And I haven't seen as many, you know, in use that are doing something more sophisticated. Kind of from the, you know, most well-known literature, I'd expect anonymous credentials of some kind to be used more. It very well may be that anonymous credentials are used, even if not by that name, by some of the decentralized identity projects, where, you know, the mechanism lets you disclose something about your credential you got from somewhere without the whole thing. If more of those are in use that are using the generic ZK, then I don't know the best examples to point to, though.
Yeah, you already mentioned a little bit what's coming on the line with, I think, Zcash there in the future. I would perhaps, yeah, like for you to draw out maybe what is kind of like an open challenge that, you know, you would still love for someone to solve. Like if, you know, you could put a bounty on something, you're like, this is really hard, no one's really paying enough attention, but I would really love for this to be solved. It can be technical, it can be something like someone should really draw more attention on XYZ. Is there something where you just like, this is poking around your brain and you'd like to outsource it if only you could?
That is that's a pretty cool question too.
We are thinking of doing bounties for these podcasts, so to actually generate people to submit answers if they want to, and then have people have bounties paid on this if this works well. So this is one opportunity for you to just make a wish. And
man, is that a good way to do that? Yeah, I'd probably have to send something in as a video soundbite. Maybe I can do that if I think of an appropriate answer for that.
Okay, totally. Great. So, you know, that the idea is really like, you know, for this podcast to just give, yeah, I guess educate folks a little bit more, but then also, you know, to have like, if there are specific bits that people can already contribute to, or like things that they could solve, like making it as actionable as possible, I think could be nice for those who want to. But I also would love to know maybe as a, you know, maybe as a devil's advocate argument. I don't know if you have a great answer to this, but you know, maybe steel manning the side of not shielded transactions. Like, are there any risks that you see that we should be wary about, that where you actually think that, okay, folks have a point here, we need to, as a community, guard against this better, so that when things go wrong, they don't go massively wrong to maybe cause a backlash against shielded transactions. Is there anything where,
that is a really good question, and I don't have the greatest answer for that. I mean, there's so many legitimate and kind of good goals that come from the same place that says, oh, let's not have shielded transactions, or let's have more things public so that law enforcement and social policies can work either easier or more effectively. I spent some time thinking about this in the context of central bank digital currencies, also trying to anticipate what things they would find in terms of trying to compete with cryptocurrencies for having all the good aspects of cryptography and blockchain design, while also meeting all of their goals, and so these kind of come up as well. So while I don't have a good answer, I think the only thing I think is a useful reaction that I have is about, I guess it relates to what I said also about the kind of danger of privacy failures by accident. I think that there's some expectation in mistaken expectation in the cryptocurrency developer world that the way that cryptocurrencies do it in a decentralized way, and say, ideally with the full support for shielded functionality, that banks won't be able to, or mainstream institutions won't be able to compete with those, because they'll be stuck using only the full backdoor transparent kind of alternative. So I basically think that there's an underestimation of the design space. So I think that a really likely outcome is that there's quite a lot of flexible, hybrid privacy mitigations, where, for example, and I think this is the direction that view keys and Zcash are headed, and I can expect there to be a whole lot more, variations of those. So, I mean, I think that institutions will find it, sufficient to basically be able to require you to make certain kinds of disclosures, but still in a more limited way. Let me give the better example that I think is kind of interesting and positive to look forward to. I think that there's a good precedent for being able to prove that, say, your portfolio isn't systemically risky, that your portfolio isn't in such a lopsided fashion that it's a problem for the rest of the society market health. But to prove that requires a zero knowledge proof. It doesn't require you to actually disclose that entire thing. This is in a hypothetical future world where you have zero knowledge proofs about all of your DeFi positions, is where that kind of fits in. So, I mean, that's an example of something that can achieve the social goal, and in some limited case, without having to do that disclosure. So, I mean, that's on the positive side. But I also think that that's, I think that there's going to be really steep competition that cryptocurrencies face from, mainstream institutions. And in the best case scenario, it's competition that, results in both being well. So I think that we'll have eventually good privacy mitigations that are socially mandated, laws require that you don't have to be compelled to disclose more than the minimum amount of information for this, well-motivated social task. And so I think the ability to have the entirely shielded, cryptocurrency developed side is basically going to, in any case, serve as the important competition that, any good thing that happens in terms of privacy mitigations, I think in future systems that incorporate blockchains will, have their competition from decentralized cryptocurrencies as the cause of it.
Great. I know we're at the hour. Eugene has maybe one final question, which is again on actionability. And if possible, if you could tie some of Zcash's future work into that answer, that would be fantastic. Eugene, do you want to ask away?
Yeah, the quick question is, whether it's in Web3 specific or just talking privacy preserving tech more broadly, if you're talking to someone who's not a deep technologist and just starting on their path and learning about this, what do you see as a good way to actually get to interact and play around with this so that they get more excited and really want to get to the point of understanding the importance and depth of this?
At this point, Zooko always asks people to download a Zach wallet.
Yeah, have you had so I spend most of my time with when I showed people You said this is for non-technologists, so right? So, I mean, I think that everyone should be playing with at least Solidity smart contracts on something like Remix. I really like to do this like intro kind of demo of starting from nothing on a test net. You get some coins from a faucet, but then the next thing that you do isn't stop there, but actually pull up the live code editor, and then you start by sending a transaction to an unknown contract, just because that's getting the interaction of it out of the way, and that's important to kind of understanding it. But the next step is then opening up the Remix browser and then writing code that you send to that contract and have it execute. You get to play with this, real world. Getting Sandwich attacked by the Dark Forest is like the next step on that. But to me, the most exciting thing, and it's then the gateway to the privacy tech, because signatures are right there. But I think like the current ecosystem of smart contracts, I spent a lot of time recently basically looking at all of these DeFi clones. So I have this kind of half amused and half very cynical view of them, but they're all EVM clones of the exact same kind of swapping features, like that their palette swaps, color backgrounds change, all the mascots are different. But seeing like the rapid copy paste and iterate a little bit, kind of behavior, it's just such a weird, complicated and rapidly evolving space. It's really interesting to see programs written by completely unrelated developers, each with their own boundaries set by those developers, but then interacting on this public system. It makes no sense from the privacy perspective, but at the trade-off of that is like there's no better time to get started in it, because everything is just so visible and transparent and easy to access. So I think people should be learning Solidity as a second programming language, if not a first programming language. And for sure, anyone who's not a technologist themselves, but is willing to try should try writing your first smart contract program and see it on a public network, and I think you won't be the same afterwards.
Cool. One final bit. Anything that you're doing personally, security-wise, that no one, like that other people really aren't doing, but really should be doing, like really just like as an actionable thing that I could be doing after this call, like how can I better protect myself?
Yeah, that would probably be the moment when I would say pull out Zcash and download that. Yeah, if you want to do something to protect your privacy, I think the most important thing is to make zero knowledge proofs. I think it's a simple kind of training comment in a way. That previous answer was about getting the practice doing smart contract programming a couple of years ago. Before smart contract programming was this much fun, it would have been scan a QR code and use a public key. And I think right now, making a zero knowledge proof is the best way that you can participate. So making a Zcash transaction from a phone wallet, that counts, and that's the easiest and most accessible way. The next step after that is to probably download one of the smart contract integrations with those, like Socrates or that's probably the one that I would start with, or Circom basically, and then then do both, then make a smart contract and put a zero knowledge proof there. That can be done today on a test net, but still a public test network for pennies, if any, transaction fees. And to me, that's like I never thought years ago that day would come, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, we see the same here in the chat, where someone's just like, how far we've come. I'm sure, I mean, I haven't been around, and especially not in the community for very long, but it's just, I think, really must be very rewarding for many of you guys to see that suddenly people like me can experiment with this. So very, very cool. Thank you so much, Andrew. Thanks for staying a little longer. Thank you everyone for joining. This was really, really fun. I can't wait for our next one. And I like co-hosting a podcast with all of you guys. This is really fun. Okay, thanks, Andrew. And I will wait for your soundbite on the challenge. But I think from now, I'll see you guys for the next one. We also have more of the focus groups where all of you guys actually get to brainstorm with each other. But thanks. This was really, really great. And yeah, I hope you all have a lovely day, and see you at the next one. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. This was fun. Thanks for having me, everyone. Bye-bye. I'm happy for the chance to present this bounty for development of shielded technologies. So this bounty is about making airdrops that work to shielded transaction pools rather than to transparent shielded pools. So this would mean everyone who holds coins in a shielded transaction pool, say Zcash Sapling, for example, is able to redeem corresponding amount of newly airdrop tokens on some new chain or token platform per your choice. And the goal of this bounty is to do it in a way that still preserves the same underlying privacy of the existing shielded transaction ledger. So redeeming your airdrop shouldn't create any linkability hazards with your transactions on the underlying shielded pool. I think this is a great technical challenge for someone who wants to get experience working on SNARKs, zero-knowledge proofs. It's an approachable problem because it can start from existing examples, but involves modifying the cryptography, getting your hands dirty, so to speak. But the goals of it are pretty clear because airdrops are fairly commonplace and popular in the transparent world, but doing the shielded version of that is an interesting open challenge. I have just a couple of illustrations to explain why this is an interesting technical challenge, but an approachable one, and give some hints of how to get started. So to start with, we know how airdrops on an ordinary transparent ledger work. You take a snapshot of the ledger, like the account balances, unspent transaction outputs, at some time, and it works because you're repurposing the exact same public keys and digital signature algorithm and secret keys defined by the parent chain. You're just repurposing them in the airdrop chain. So the signatures are the same. You just sign an airdrop redeeming transaction. It's interpreted on the airdrop chain rather than the parent chain. But the signatures and secret keys are all the same, is what makes these work. In the shielded pool setting, it's a little more complicated because the unspent account balances, they aren't in plain text, they're in these commitments in the leaves of a note commitments tree for a shielded ledger. And so to spend them, what you're doing is making a zero-knowledge proof that you know the corresponding secret keys, that the nullifier that you're revealing is a unique nullifier associated with that coin, that it's one of the coins in the tree, but you're not revealing which. And so to imagine doing an airdrop to this, you would start by using the same zero-knowledge proof, but the first problem is you would have to do something about the nullifier. You can't just reveal the same nullifier as would be revealed when redeeming it on the parent chain, on the Zcash chain, because that would mean that when you redeem the airdrop, you publish a nullifier. It exactly corresponds to the same nullifier, a transaction containing the same nullifier on the parent chain. That would create a linkability between the airdrop and transactions on the parent chain, and that the goal of this is to preserve the privacy, preserve unlinkability, and not reveal that. So that's the first challenge. And the second one is to do something about the exact amount. You wouldn't want, if you redeem multiple airdrops for a transparent amount of airdrop token, you wouldn't want that to reveal that these two airdrop redemptions came from spending the same note with exactly that account balance. So just to recap, the goals of this bounty are to make an airdropping mechanism that works for the existing Zcash shielded ledger. And the point of it is to preserve the underlying privacy guarantees of the existing shielded ledger. And ideally, it should support multiple airdrops, even that are redeemed based on the same notes in the underlying chain. And all of these together should be entirely unlinkable between each other. So that's all. I hope you find this an interesting and engaging challenge to work on, and wish you good luck with it.